better never ends. In health, in performance, no matter your starting point, you can always strive for better. My name's Charlie Goodchild, I'm your host, and this is the Better Never Ends podcast. We've made it our mission to share with you the expertise and wisdom of role models and leading experts in their field, teaching us about how we can be better, telling stories about their journey to better, and inspiring you to discover yours. Okay, today we're welcoming Matt Murray-Downing into the studio. Matt is a physiotherapist. He's also part of the Better team. He joined the team about a year ago and has definitely been a really great part of the team so far. We have lots of interesting chats, and we were sitting down the other day over a coffee and decided that actually there was probably a lot to be said about physio. And then I realised, as a physio hosting a podcast 30 odd episodes in, we haven't spoken that much about physiotherapy, and I haven't had a chance to get up on my high horse about things that we often as society just get slightly wrong or misunderstand. And I thought this would be a great opportunity for us to have that conversation. So Matt, you've got lots to say as well. We got chatting and you've got lots of ideas. So hopefully today will be a bit of a toing and froing between me and you about the physio world and some things that we might be able to help explain and discuss. And I think there'll be lots of surprising stuff in here, and some things that we as physios say quite often, but in society we often misunderstand or are just told wrong, basically. I think that's fair to say. But first of all, Matt, if you don't mind, could you give us a bit of an overview about you and your career and what's led you to working with me at Better?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in MSK practice now for coming up for 8 years. Always had an interest in kind of musculoskeletal injuries, and kind of started very much in a NHS-based clinic, and kind of started to develop a kind of broad spectrum of knowledge. Had some great mentors from an early point in my career, so felt like I got exposed to kind of a lot of different approaches and was very evidence-led right from the beginning, which I found very helpful. But also kind of going to lots of different conferences early on in my career, kind of got a feel for the fact that actually there was a lot of different things going on in lots of different places. And that kind of evolved, and we ended up kind of crossing paths at Pure in London, at which point my career kind of took some different turns in the sense of I was working in kind of an MSK private practice, but also working in elite sport. So originally that started in football and then moved to gymnastics, which I've been involved with the Olympic team for the last 6 years now. And then in the last 4 years, kind of more into the Formula One and the kind of motorsport world, where my kind of role has slightly evolved into more of a performance coach role, which for those people that don't know is kind of more of a physio, S&C, nutritionist, kind of general athlete performance coach kind of role. Lots of things kind of merged into one. So it meant that I had to perhaps lean on skills that I already had, but also kind of really delve into kind of a different knowledge base and skill base that perhaps I wasn't so experienced in. So kind of led for this much broader spectrum, which I think definitely had a positive impact on my physiotherapy. And kind of that's where I guess we came back together after Pure, was to kind of then acknowledge actually that both were really passionate about physio and delivering better care to people and showing them actually that there's perhaps a slightly different way of doing this that delivers better results. Yeah, and I think it's something we both agree on here, that some physiotherapists evolve into more of a coaching philosophy, and it's a terminology I've been using in the last year or two is the physio coach. So not necessarily a physiotherapist, with the definitions being that a therapist is often aligned more towards fixing someone and really actively helping the person by doing something to them, a treatment or some kind of intervention, whereas coaching is helping that person help themselves, finding a way where you connect with them and they can almost figure out the solution for a longer term fix. It's a mentality I much prefer, and I think it's much more empowering, it's collaborative, but it's a skill in its own right, isn't it? And I, by the sounds of it, you've certainly gone into that coaching world and have had good success with that. And I definitely find I enjoy my profession more when I'm coaching than when I'm therapying, if that's a verb. So I think it's something that is a skill that often isn't spoken about, that coaching skill. And I really think that there's a lot to be said about that. And I speak to a lot of personal trainers where we work now, and the good ones seem to really get the coaching side of it. What do you make of that, the coaching side? What did you take from that? Yeah, I think it's definitely one of those things. I think we know. I think as physios, we get taught about the idea of different patients wanting different things. I think the private world is perhaps better at understanding the fact that different clients may have different expectations. I think probably then to take that one step further, you're right. I think the until model that we've got here is quite interesting in the sense of actually as physios to be around different professionals from different, we've got a lot more osteos around, we've got the PTs around. And actually, there's a lot more similarities than perhaps as physios sometimes we often give credit for. And actually, that interaction, whatever your professional background is kind of the same in a way. You're trying to, everyone's got an expectation, the client's got a desired outcome, and it's how you reach that is a skill in itself.
Yeah, for sure. And we've had this conversation with osteopaths and chiropractors on this podcast before about we're probably more similar than we are different. And although we might start off with a different way of teaching, we've all got the same evidence available to us, and we all get presented with the same problems and are trying to get people better, essentially trying to help people towards their goals. So I think as a result, it's more likely that we're going to end up blending and looking more similar than we are different. But there's still this mindset that some people, I've heard some people say this, where they say, well, I've had physio before, it didn't work for me, or I've had osteopathy before and it didn't work for me. I've had chiro, it didn't work for me. And I think ultimately that just means that person didn't work for you, and that person has potentially failed you rather than the profession as an entirety. So it's about finding a person that can work with you and a person that can really work with you towards your goals. And that might be a physio, it might be a chiro, it might be a PT, whatever it could be. But it's that coaching mentality of really supporting someone through that I think is more likely to work in the long term, especially for those ones that probably aren't just going to get better themselves. They actually need some form of support, some form of coaching.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely interesting. I think there's definitely a bit of ego that has to go with that as well. Like I know we talk a lot about it at Bet in terms of the people that we work with, but actually often in the first consultation is figuring out, a little bit about that individual, what's worked in the past, what hasn't worked, and making sure that you suit them as well. I think one of the biggest things I've learned or taken from elite sport, I think, into my practice has been the fact that sometimes you're not the right person for them, and it's really important that you spot that early, have that conversation. Actually, sometimes having that conversation can switch that in its head, and actually you are the right person because they like that vulnerability of that conversation. But yeah, I think that's a key thing. There's
this concept that I like of being the chameleon, where we've all got these different ways of being, and we can express different parts of our personality depending on the person in front of us. And certainly in the first session, but sometimes even through the first few sessions, I'm figuring out which version of my clinical self am I going to express for this person in front of me. Sometimes if they're really outgoing, I don't really need to try so much. I can just bounce off their energy. Whereas if they're maybe a bit quieter, a bit more nervous perhaps, I might have to be that energy or that calming force for them. So you're trying to understand what it is that's going to get the best outcomes for that person. Again, it's coaching. How do I help that person get the best experience here and therefore have the best expectation of recovery? And I guess that expectation side of it almost moves us towards a conversation here about placebo maybe and expectations of effect. I enjoy this chat a lot because I think in general placebo is considered a bad thing it's just placebo that's working here. But hang on a minute, right? We know placebo is an absolutely guaranteed way of getting a treatment effect from someone. They compare treatment to placebo. They don't compare treatment to no treatment. They compare it to placebo because they know that even a fake pill, a fake treatment, a sham treatment gets an effect. So we know it works. So why wouldn't we lean on that a little bit? So my thoughts on that are that it's not quite placebo, but people's expectation for recovery are influenced by a multitude of things. So we've got reviews. So if someone reads reviews online and they're really positive, they think that you're going to be a good clinician. Great, that's a good thing. Let's get more reviews. I know a lot of physios and clinicians are actually quite nervous about reviews for some reason. I don't like that vulnerability of potentially getting a bad one maybe. And then we've got the website. Someone looks at the website. Oh, that looks a professional website. Look at all those videos. They look really good. Again, heightens their expectation for recovery. Is that a bad thing? Surely not. If you're a good enough clinician, you can stand up to that and you can deliver on those expectations. And if you do, their expectations are already high, you can meet them. And you've got things like the mannerisms that you give, the welcome, you're smiling, you're welcoming them professionally. You've got the clean and comfortable environment. We're here at a really nice facility and we're very lucky that they look around and they think, oh yeah, fancy surroundings. It must be a good physio that's going to be here. So you see what I mean? There's all these different effects, which I believe are actually called contextual effects, which enhance the expectation for recovery and therefore make it more likely they're going to recover. Why would we not lean on those?
Absolutely. I think it's such an interesting area. I think you're right, we've got a lot of those contextual things, which I know we spoke about in the past. As you say, there's lots of things we can wrap up, and certainly for us, we have very high-end facilities, and there's an element of people coming and think, right, this is different. This is really nice. This must be pucker. But also, I think we see that with our treatment as well. So without getting into the broad topic, but we almost then creep into, we spoke in the physio world, one of the big things is manual therapy being the kind of perhaps the talk of placebo. I guess our evidence over the last few years has shown that actually we're probably not doing an awful lot with manual therapy when it comes to changing that tissue.
Yeah.
But we know it has one, it can have a really positive effect. People can move better or perhaps engage with our exercise better, which is where perhaps our evidence is pushing us towards. But also a lot of our patients, have that link with physio, and historically, a physio puts his hands on me or her hands on me and something's done, and therefore we've met that expectation. So I think as long as it's wrapped up in the right packaging and people, we come with the right message that, this is going to enable us to get into the gym. Brilliant. You're feeling better. Awesome. We can start this. And this is part of the journey. Yeah. I think it's fine. I think it falls apart when it gets ostracized too far one way or the other, or the message is wrong.
Yeah. Because there's this nice diagram I've seen before where it essentially says, well, if you can't find my pain, then you don't know what's going on with me. That's the expectation, or that's what the belief is for the patient quite often. So you then have to put your hands on. You have to be able to touch their pain or recreate their pain in one way or another. Perhaps you could do that with movement, but they still want you to touch it. So one way or another, we should be hands on just for that, just for our examination, in order to say, here we go, here's your pain. And then how powerful if we can modulate that pain in one way or another. We can reduce that pain, make it feel better. Oh, wow, the physio was able to reduce my pain. And then comes the nuance. Then we have to wrap it up in an explanation that says, just to be really clear here, this isn't me fixing your problem. This is me now understanding your diagnosis. I now know that when I can change your pain, your prognosis is really good, because when we can change your pain, that means it's something that's modifiable, at least in the short term, but maybe even in the long term, there's a really good outcome that's likely here. But also, I now know what structures are likely causing your problem. And therefore, here's the solution, here's the exercise, here's the load management strategy, here's the things we're going to do. It's part of a package, right? And I'm not going to get too carried away and say, you're going to now need me to massage you every session and blah, 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 because that's not the reality. But a few sessions of hands-on certainly helps to reduce pain, build some confidence into moving again. And during that hands-on session, guess what I'm doing? I'm talking, I'm educating, I'm connecting, discussing. It's a nice little opportunity to do it. And there's this other thing, actually, I think this was another physio that mentioned this that I used to work with, and she said that her patients are much more likely to open up and be vulnerable when they're facing down on the bed, because they don't have to make eye contact with you. How powerful is that? There's some things that people just don't want to say until they're laying down, because they're not quite comfortable saying it for whatever reason. They're embarrassed about it. They've got a bit of shame attached to it, maybe. But they'll only say it when they're face down. So your subjective examination, your questioning continues during your hands-on treatment. Yeah. So then it becomes part and parcel of the whole process of getting to know this person, right?
Yeah, I think those are the conversations I think personally are the key to delivering results, because, and perhaps patients are sometimes taken a bit back by this. You come to me with your back pain, and, yes, we're going to explore exercise, and they expect me to talk about their pain and how long it's lasted. But actually, when we start delving into, you're right, some of these conversations around, well, how's your mental health like that? That seems like a left field question, and we do have to, we'll often pick it out, but it takes a little bit of strategic kind of placement of where that's going to be. But also going back to what we were saying about the kind of hands-on stuff, actually, I think is, making sure that's quality, is making sure that you explain that journey and why there might be a change. Because again, yes, we might meet the expectation every day. So-and-so comes in and they get that hands-on. 3 sessions in, when I feel like actually that pain modulation's really worked, we're moving better, and all of a sudden we're in the gym and they're going, oh, hang on, I'm not completely better, and we're going into the gym yet. Well, actually, if I haven't laid that journey out and why we're doing those different things, or wrap the message up right, that's going to be a shock. Whereas actually it should all be part of that initial kind of, this is why we do the manual therapy, and then actually this leads us into a really nice part of the treatment process where the evidence lies. Yeah. But we know we can't get you there yet. We just got to help you out.
Yeah, and this is why I think communication is one of the most powerful skills for clinicians and trainers. And again, it comes back to coaching. I think you're better coaches when you communicate well. So it's hugely important. And this is why I spend a lot of time listening as well, listening and delving and probing with the questions, trying to get a bit more information out of that person. You never know when that key bit of information is going to come through. Maybe it is when they're face down on the bed. Maybe it is when you're doing some massage treatment because they're relaxed and feeling better about it and now confident that you can help them because you've managed to reduce their pain. Or maybe it's just in the gym and spending the time with them. That's why we do the longer sessions. As a standard in Better, we have an hour so we can relax and chat and get to know them and delve and practice and trial and discuss things, maybe not relevant, but part of connection. So I think part and parcel of what we do is just all about building that trust and building connection.
And on the coaching point, that just makes me think straight away is actually, I think one of the things we've discussed actually as our physio careers development for those physios or any coach listening who's taking people on that journey through injury or pain is, we've said it before, we feel like sometimes these physio courses are really stagnant. And actually, it doesn't matter if you're a physio or you're a PT, we're all taking on our patients on a journey from A to B to help them achieve something. And actually some of the best things we've done have perhaps been when we've thought laterally, and we stopped going to the physio conferences and where everyone's perhaps thinking along the same lines, and we've gone to different environments where people are thinking completely different, but actually it's offered us so many different solutions, and therefore we can be that different chameleon for different situations.
Yeah, lovely. Me bouncing my ideas back at me. And I think what as we're talking about manual therapy here and what we are and aren't doing, as you've said already, we're not changing the structure of a muscle. We're not breaking down scar tissue. These things that actually aren't happening. And they're things that, even before I was a physio and maybe even in my early days as a physio, I believed that these things were going on. So of course, your average person coming in, that's what they believe too, because that's their expectation, that's society's understanding of what's going on. Sometimes it doesn't really matter whether they think that or not, as long as we're taking them through the right journey. But then you might have to have a conversation with them about, well, we're not really changing the muscle structure here. That's what the exercises are for. But what we might be doing is changing the sensitization of the tissue. And sensitization is a massive topic in itself, isn't it? Because you can get all sorts of different potential reasons for tissue sensitization, and that can exist in both acute pain, which is the pain that's just come on a recent injury, or chronic pain that's been hanging around for way too long that shouldn't really be there and actually doesn't correlate to any structural change. So I think that's a good conversation for us to maybe have here now, and the difference between acute pain and chronic pain. And I've heard some people think that, and I'm not surprised that acute pain is bad pain or chronic pain is bad pain. It's not necessarily, which is actually one of the reasons why they changed the definition officially to persistent pain, because it's more of a time rather than a severity or an annoyance factor. So how do you have that conversation around kind of acute pain, chronic pain, persistent pain with clients coming into you?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because I think chronic pain, I think acute pain people understand pretty well and they're quite comfortable with it. I think the idea of an acute injury, you've come into us a couple of days post rolling your ankle, or you've broke your leg or whatever. I think people can come to terms with that and understand the process of healing quite well, and why we've experienced pain seems quite obvious. I think the chronic pain is definitely a more challenging discussion for a number of reasons. I think one, because perhaps it has a lot of negative connotations around the word chronic pain. Yeah, I think it gets thrown around a lot, and therefore people, I think, attach it to certain types of individual or people with certain issues or whatever. So I think a lot of us it's a stigmatized word. So I think you're right, perhaps persistent pain is a better, we seem to be moving more towards that, which I think is a good thing. It's harder as well, I think, because there isn't, I think with the acute pain, we've got a very straightforward way of looking at it and the way that it might settle, and it's very easy to study that and read that in a textbook and see and make sense of that. Whereas again, I think if we move on to the persistent pain model, it's much harder to explain. There's not necessarily something on a scan, there's not necessarily a clear cause, and often these patients have had very tricky journeys often in terms of the way they may have understand, or different people have taken them on that journey of understanding what's going on. So I think that's what makes it very difficult.
Yeah, or there is something on the scan, they treated it and it made no difference. That's where it gets really tricky. And I think we'll come to scans in a little while, because that's definitely an important thing to talk about regarding pain. But certainly the acute pain stuff is the bit that people do get, right? So let's start with acute pain. So you sprain your ankle, you've damaged some ligaments, you will have some swelling as an immediate effect of that injury. Potentially some ligament fibers have torn, and that bleeds. So this is an explanation I use with quite often, and I draw it out on bits of paper. So yeah, acute pain, injury to the tissue, very similar to a skin cut, is that you get bleeding straight away. You'll also get inflammation almost instantly. It's triggered by the process of bleeding. That inflammation peaks at around 1 to 3 days, which is why people often feel worse the next day, because that swelling has got worse. And it's the inflammation itself that's sensitizing all the nerves surrounding that area, which is then sending signals to your brain. It's your brain's job to decide what it does with those signals. So sometimes it might completely ignore it for reasons of distraction or relevance. So ultimately your brain is always in charge of pain, whether it's acute or chronic, right? So this is a really interesting conversation that you can quite often relate to everyday experiences for people, where you can say, have you ever played sport where you got to the end of the match and you notice an injury that you don't remember? It's because your brain is distracted in that moment. It's more important for you to do your sporting task than it is to worry about that bruise on your leg. Whereas if you weren't playing sport, someone runs into your leg, it really hurts and you immediately notice it, but you might forget about it or not notice it at all in the heat of battle, because it's more important that you, ultimately sport is recreating all of that, those battle emotions, right? So, and another thing, if you're crossing the road, you roll your ankle, there's a bus coming towards you. What do you think is the most important thing to do? Worry about the pain in your ankle or get out of the road? Probably going to get out of the road no matter how bad your ankle's feeling, one way or another. Once you get to the other side, I imagine your pain's then going to come roaring back and it's going to be really bloody painful. So it's even with acute pain, we can think of examples where your brain that's in charge can just decide how much it is there or not. And this is the case across individuals, but also within the individual. So different people perceive pain differently. That person can perceive pain differently depending on the context. So even on the relatively straightforward example of an acute injury, there's nuance and there's differences and there's interesting parts to explain to a person. And sometimes people can come in with an acute injury and be really bloody worried, really concerned and really terrified. Part of our job is reassurance. If we can give them a real clarity and confidence that they're going to get better, they might leave with less pain, whether we touch them or not. I mean, we should because we examine, but it's not so much the treatment we do to them, it's the conversation we have, it's the reassurance that we give. Louis Gifford, a fantastic physiotherapist, he said reassurance is a bloody good painkiller. And that's a really powerful message for a lot of physios out there, but also for, people who are injured. Make sure you go and see someone who can accurately assess with confidence, give you a real clear plan of action, because that's the kind of thing that's reassuring.
And I think to go one step further, so you're actually right, how many patients have we seen where you come in, you sit down with them, and they go, oh, I feel so much better, and we haven't done anything, we've just had a conversation, and they go, actually, the fact that someone has acknowledged their pain, you sit down with them and go, yeah, I see thousands of these, and this is a really normal, this level of pain is normal, it's going to last roughly this length of time, and I think that's a really comforting thing for people to hear. I think the other thing to bear in mind with those acute injuries as well, both chronic and I guess the kind of acute injuries, is again expectation of pain. So we spoke earlier about some great studies out there around expectations and kind of that self-fulfilling prophecy that if you think something's going to be sore or you're worried something's going to be sore, you're likely to have pain for longer. So particularly in those patients who we don't know, an ankle sprain, as we use that as an example. I get a lot of this with my gymnasts, and actually we talk about how long they might experience pain and how where I want that pain to be and where I don't want that pain to be. And actually, if I get them moving sooner, get them comfortable with some level of discomfort, and actually we see that their symptoms improve because their expectations are right.
Yeah. And there's a skill to that. We have to be confident in our own abilities and know what we're doing here, because it's that people are coming to us for our expertise and our reassurance. And we can only do that if we're confident in what we do with our movements, with our assessments, with our conversations and our communications. And sometimes we don't know the exact answer, and it's still a skill to then be able to confidently sit on the fence, to be able to say, at this stage, there's no way for me to understand whether it's this or this, but the process in order for us to understand is A, is B, is C. And if A turns out to not quite work out, we have the option of B. If B doesn't quite work out, we have the option of C. But at this stage, there isn't even a scan that can help us, for example. So it's being able to say, I don't know at this stage, but I do know how we're going to find out one way or another. And it might involve other practitioners, it might involve different interventions, but this is the way that you're going to get your results. And that works out pretty well. And in living in this world, the algorithms really reward binary opinions, one way or another. I think we should really be celebrating the alternative, getting good in the grey, being comfortable sitting in that grey area. It's not black or white. It's a bit of both. It's murky. It depends. There's no way of us knowing here, and it depends on too many things for us to understand yet. So here's our process. I think it gets our job gets really interesting when we start getting comfortable in the grey.
I totally agree, and I love anyone who's had any treatment from me knows I love an analogy with my patients, and for me, I love that parent-child analogy of your role as a parent, right? You get very comfortable in the grey, you go away, maybe your kids are nervous about going on holiday, you don't know what the airport's going to look like, but you know that you've got the skills to be able to find a taxi, use Uber, find how the train system works. So again, you go in comfortable and you reassure them in knowing actually there's going to be a few options when we arrive at the airport, and this is how I'm going to deal with those. Or, they might be nervous about food choices, where there'll be a menu. And I love the analogy with patients that, look, we've got enough medical knowledge to be able to rule out the nasty stuff. Actually, we know there could be a couple of scenarios that could play out over the coming weeks, which will guide you through.
Yeah.
If something doesn't go to plan, we're going to go this way. And if it does go to plan, hey, look, we're all happy and we're moving in that direction. So that for me is a really nice analogy for patients of that journey, where sometimes we don't know, we could have 4 different ankle sprains and they all look different in 6 weeks' time, but we're okay with that. And we know that each one will have a different route.
And how cool is it that we can literally give someone a flare-up plan? We can say, you might flare up. In fact, it's more likely that you're going to flare up at some point. But when you do, this is what happens. The confidence and the bravery to be able to say that, because we know that it's the reality. Whereas the alternative is saying, don't worry, I know exactly what you need to do here. You do this, 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 and this, and you're going to get better. Well, every now and again, you might get lucky and that does happen. But when it doesn't happen, that person might lose faith in you because you told them that they were going to get better. And then you had a flare-up, and they now don't really know what to do because they feel a bit lost. Maybe they feel like they've let you down or that you've let them down one way or another. But that's not a very good experience for that person, when the reality is that it's so variable and it's so common that people do flare up. We need to be able to prepare them for that reality.
And I think also, going a step further, a lot of my patients are, let's say, back pain patients, for example. That's probably why pain sometimes not always a good marker to go off, even on that topic of pain. So, a lot of the patients come to us, and I'd urge any physio who's doing an assessment, we talk about outcome measures, and in a lot of these both acute and chronic pain patients, we can't just have pain as our only marker of improvement, because we're not necessarily always expecting every part of that journey to be an improvement in pain necessarily. So making sure that we've got a broader scope of how things are going. Had a patient last week off the top of my head who was a spinal patient, and pain levels are probably unchanged actually from, I saw her 2 weeks ago. Her pain levels are probably similar. She's scoring a kind of 3 or 4 out of 10. Her range of movement's twice as good. She's in the gym. She wasn't in the gym 2 weeks ago. She's going out for walks. She's seeing, that's a huge level of improvement. And if we're not writing that down or taking some time to look at these different objective markers, actually when she sits back, it's quite an emotional journey, and actually her pain's not changed. Yeah,
and this is where we can frame it in a different way. So that's, for me, that's relative progress. So we say, look, you're making relative improvements here, because although your pain has stayed the same, look how much more you're doing, and your pain hasn't got worse. Because for some of these people, that's what's happened historically. They've done more and their pain's got worse. So that's what they're scared of, rightly so. So if you're able to then frame it in a different way and help them, guide them towards a different journey where they do get fitter, they can do more in their life, they're able to function to a higher level and their pain stays the same, there's still progress. Because quite often with these tissue sensitizations, which will come to when we speak a bit more about chronic pain, the pain doesn't change for a long, long time or ever. And that's the sad reality for some, is that they will have pain forever. But at least they can progress and they can live their life despite the pain. That's hard for some people because they come to us to get rid of it. But unfortunately for some, they will have pain forever, but they still want to live their life. So they have a choice to make. Do you live your life, or do you choose not to live your life because of the pain? So you live life despite pain. It's a really powerful thing to do. And I think also it's that understanding that some pain for people, and some injuries as well, the pain is almost a necessary part of their recovery. Tendons, we know, for example, they're very sensitive, but going through low levels of pain and tolerable levels of pain doesn't seem to affect the outcome. And if anything, it almost is almost a necessary part, because if you don't have any pain, you're probably not loading enough into the tendon pain. So sometimes that's a really key part for them to understand, and for us to accurately diagnose, yes, this is a tendon. Okay, this is a safe marker of pain. Let's call it a 4. Provided your pain stays around this level for exercise or for your rehab, whatever it might be, or your activities, then let's consider that safe. Then let's monitor it overnight. How does it feel the next day? Is it worse than usual, or is it the same as usual? If it's worse, okay, we might have overcooked it. Let's recalibrate. Let's call it a 3 out of 10 for your future exercise. Or, it's gone well, great. Then let's keep it as a 4 out of 10, because that means that you're probably loading the tendon enough for it to get stronger and the muscles to get stronger, but not so much that you're flaring up the problem. And it's a really nuanced conversation and a really delicate one to have, to say it's actually safe for you to go into this pain, because generally, as we've been speaking about acute injuries, pain is there to protect you and tell you to not do something, quite wisely as well, right? We've evolved in order for pain to be there as a very good warning system to back off and protect some structures, because biology on average is pretty good at healing injuries. So let's take that acute injury a little further. So we spoke a bit about an ankle sprain, bleeding happens, then inflammation kicks in straight away. We know pretty soon after the bleeding happens, it clots up, which is what happens on the skin. So we know that analogy quite well. And after a few days, inflammation starting to drop down naturally. That inflammation is there very deliberately, right? Again, evolution has done that on purpose. Inflammation is a necessary part of healing. So what happens when we come in and start taking anti-inflammatory medications? We're getting rid of the inflammation and also potentially slowing down our healing. So if your pain is so bad that you're not sleeping and you can't function and you're suffering real bad, then maybe you might need anti-inflammatories. And this is normally the advice I give to patients. But if you're coping okay with pain, then you might choose not to have anti-inflammatories in that first week, maybe at least the first few days when that inflammation is at its peak. So I think it's quite a difficult reality for some people to accept, that the swelling's supposed to be there. The inflammation is there for a reason. Once it lasts longer than that, I'm much more comfortable for people to take anti-inflammatories and help get that pain maybe a little better and help them function a bit better. But yeah, those early days in the first week or so, trying to just allow for it. And then it takes us on to a conversation about ice, which we posted on our Instagram recently. That, historically we thought ice was an anti-inflammatory, and it is a very mild anti-inflammatory, if at all, but actually it does more for pain than it does for anything else. So if you're really struggling with pain and you want to take anti-inflammatories, maybe ice first, because it doesn't really seem to do much for inflammation, but it might modulate pain for the better. So yeah, that's definitely surprising for most people when you say that, because they think, well, I've had an acute injury, I'm going to ice it straight away. And there may not be any harm with that, but it's not as important as we used to think it was.
I think I look at it a couple of ways. You're absolutely right. I think that the model of perhaps the rest ice component elevation has kind of evolved a lot over the years. I think a lot of my patients do it. I like the fact they're engaging in rehab in whatever form, so I'm always keen not to knock it down. Actually, it's a good thing that they're taking a really proactive step in trying to minimize their symptoms. But ultimately, I always go back to it, exactly as you say. It's more about how do we get you comfortable. I think ice has a real tipping point of going, okay, if you pop that ice on for 20 minutes and you feel a bit better for it, hey, that's great. Carry on with that. I think if it's someone who, I had it the other day, someone who was icing every hour, it was agony to ice it, and was like, actually, we're not really getting any benefit from this. This sounds pretty unpleasant, and it's quite time consuming. So actually in that scenario, it's probably not that useful. But I think as the model's evolved, I think people are starting to clock onto actually that tissue healing is a little bit more sophisticated than simply inflammation and then no inflammation. And I guess this is where we spoke about some of the development of things like police, peace and love, and these kind of different theories around different things we can do in these early phases to promote the different phases, as you say.
Yeah, and I think that's what it is, isn't it? So the first two, where it was ice, ice compression elevate, then rest, ice compression elevate, is very much about the early stage of recovery, and it didn't acknowledge the importance of optimizing the later stage. Yeah, so the recent one, not quite the most recent one, but police, protect, which actually is a very important thing to do, because you need to protect an injury in order to allow the body to heal optimally. Sometimes we get a bit carried away moving too much and thinking we just need to get moving straight away. It's not always the case. So yeah, you protect and then optimally load, POL, optimally load. And that might be pretty restful to begin with, but then it might be gradually building up towards the stages of proliferation, which is essentially making new cells. So the next phase after inflammation for healing is proliferation. So growing new cells in order to replace the damaged cells. This is a fairly messy process. It's laying down all sorts of stuff, and there's stem cells involved, there's fibrin, there's stuff, stuff that's just plugging the gap. Imagine this being your scab when you've injured it, and this is essentially what's happening. So once you've got that stage, you can cautiously start moving, which is optimally load. Gradually that scab will become a bit more mature, and it will turn into this sort of early scar tissue where it's all sealed, and you're less likely for it to turn into a cut again. But it's still fragile stuff, and it's not as good, right? So that's where physios are really earn their money, I think, is this next phase where it goes into remodeling. So remodeling is turning the kind of ugly scar tissue, your new cells, into good, healthy, nice muscle, ligament, tendon, whatever it is, those nice cells again that function highly. And this is the stage that often gets missed because it's often pain-free by the time it's reached the start of remodeling, and it's not going to then shift into healthy stuff unless we give it some form of signal, aka rehabilitation, right? So this is the best bit. I think this is where we get to be creative and have some fun. We're trying to load that tissue up again, that optimally load it to ensure it's challenged enough so that it's stimulated into adapting into more tissue. The problem comes when people just go back to activity, or they miss that valuable stage of rehab because they're getting away with it because they've got some other muscle around it. And what they really need to be thinking about is, why did this injury happen in the first place? And ultimately, that if there was some damaged tissue, if you don't strengthen that up, there is a bit of a weakness in the structure potentially, and therefore a bit of a rehab gap, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. You're bang on. I think people in that journey, I think we're too aggressive in the initial phase. Actually, sometimes I just don't think we give enough credit. We can simplify the first stage. Absolutely.
100%.
Immobilize, give it some time. Just go and have 2 days and do nothing. And people sometimes are quite surprised when they get that advice. They go, actually, they're just going to rest. So I think the first stage, I think actually we can be a bit easier going on these injuries.
Totally agree.
Whereas I think the last stage, you're absolutely right. I can't think of, I think, as you say, physios earn the money in this category where people come in and we go, the ankle is a great example of this, right? Where someone goes, I immobilized it really well. I started on some really basic exercises, felt really good. I went back to football or rugby, etc., netball. And we go, I always say to people, the expectation that we've gone from some hill raises in the gym to like charging around, a netball pitch, it's just so the disparity is huge. Yeah. So I'd always say to anyone is, prepare yourself adequately, and it's trying to make sure, I guess, that we fill that gap with quality stuff that is going to make sure that tissue is experienced everything in our training environment that it's going to experience, hopefully, out on the playing field.
Absolutely. And this, we keep using the ankle sprain because it fits quite nicely, and we can actually discuss the differences between NHS management and private practice management here, and we'll cover the nuance here because it's neither's. The fact that it's a different management it kind of makes sense when you really think of the context. So in the NHS, someone quite often will go to A&E. They'll sometimes have an X-ray to rule out a fracture. Sometimes they won't, and they'll get reassured and said, it's just an ankle sprain. Best thing for you to do, you keep it moving, take it easy, and gradually build yourself back up over the next few weeks and get back to your activities and you'll be fine. You might get lucky and you get referred to physiotherapy and you'll pick that up at some point in 2 to 3 to 6 months. Who knows? That's just the function of the NHS. They don't really have any other ways of dealing with it. There's no resources for that. Whereas in private practice, first thing I'm going to be doing is telling them that they need to be in a boot. At the very least, they need to be on crutches and immobilizing that ankle for the first few days. And they might be in a boot for up to 4 weeks because we know the body will heal really well. So it will do that initial stage of healing. It will start laying down new structure, and you then won't be stretching the damaged ligaments again too much, because when you overstretch those ligaments, they just end up healing too long. And as a result, you end up with this structurally unstable ankle. So the idea is that you allow for the ligament fibers to heal as short as possible, and therefore have the potential to become a nice stable ankle joint again. But if the NHS gave away boots to all of the people that had ankle sprains, they'd still be in the boot 3 months later, or they'd get rid of the boot in a month and they'd just hobble around on it because they wouldn't have the knowledge and the resources for someone to help them understand that they need to get moving on it, they need to mobilise it, they need to strengthen it gradually. So you kind of get why the NHS have looked at those long-term studies and said, well, let's not give them a boot. So we'll accept the fact that some people will have ankle instability in the future because the problems are then further down the line and maybe a bit easier to fix. I don't know, maybe. Yeah. Rather than have all these people with early osteoarthritis because they've not moved their ankle properly and they've not rehabbed it. So when you've got the option of managing it properly in private practice, you then boot it, you then rehab early, you then gradually build up. You accept the fact you've got a stiff ankle and a weak calf and an muscularly unstable ankle because you can rehab it all. You can manage it all as a clinician. So this happens across the board, I think, in many different injuries. And rather than NHS bashing, we just have to accept that there's just differences in resources and therefore different ways of managing.
Yeah, and I think the other one that I think jumps out to me, Charlie, I is the ACL. It's another one that the NHS I think gets bashed for, but again, they just haven't got the resources to do it. But actually, I always think when I talk to a patient about taking that injury on and understanding it, is understanding that journey. It's a real long-term injury. There's many different stages, and I can't think of an injury that's probably so paramount that we bridge that gap between gym and sport, and one that just gets overlooked. And as you say, they often get discharged after 3 months because it's a full range of movement, strength's okay. That's what they've got capacity for, but we know there's a lot more to it now. But it's an interesting journey for patients.
Yeah, I mean, in sports, people will take a bit of a gamble and get back to playing in 7-8 months. In private practice, it's 12 months, and in both of those scenarios, they'll have quite often had pretty intensive rehabilitation where you're really challenging those structures, building the muscles up, challenging proprioception, building stability, confidence, by the way, huge part of ACL rehab and general injury rehab. And you're right, in the NHS often they're discharged at 3 months because they can't support the longer term, because ultimately the NHS is there for kind of limb and life-saving interventions and avoiding disability. Sport's not really about disability, so you kind of get it, right? So you understand why that there is a difference. It just, hopefully this conversation helps people to see that instead of kind of slamming the NHS, they just might have to make decisions about how they spend on their health. For example, if they are keen to get back to sport, it's worth the investment, because otherwise they might really struggle, have another re-injury, and then they might never go back to sport. So it's just well worth really thinking about investing when you're being a bit more ambitious with your goals. If you want to get back to something higher level, you might have to work with someone who knows how to finish that last phase of healing, which is the remodeling. Really challenge the structures, create fatigue, drive adaptations. If you want to grow your bicep, you're going to work your bicep. If you want to get a more stable ankle and a more stable knee, you need to challenge those structures in order for them to adapt sufficiently and become strong and stable again. And you could do it yourself, but it's quite hard. I'm not very good physio for me. Don't know about you, Matt.
No, terrible.
I outsource it. I'd much rather see you. So it's just about looking for the right person at the right time. And look, we've probably now covered. And I guess the only final thing to say on that, which again is why it's important to finish the rehab journey, make sure you don't have any significant deficits in strength and maybe range of movement, flexibility, whatever it might be, or stability. Because what we know about injuries is that the most common risk factor for an injury is having had that injury before. So once you've had the injury, you can't unhave it. So it's a non-modifiable risk factor. But there's lots of things that you can do in order to reduce that risk. And, we certainly know strength training in general is a protector from injury in team sports. 30 to 50% is my understanding. So we know in general there are some pretty good things that help to reduce the risk of injury that are also beneficial for health in general anyway. So I don't see and also re-injury in lots of injuries like ACL, ankles. Rehab seems to be a very good protector of that. So again, kind of singing our own praises here, aren't we, Matt? But I think, good quality rehab is essential for managing that last stage of an injury, ensuring that remodeling happens and gets people back to a nice, good, strong place.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's a grey area. I think we've got different stats, different areas. With back pain, for example, we know twice as many people seem to have back pain if they've had it before. Hamstrings, it seems to be if you've had a previous hamstring issue, that you're 4 times more likely to kind of get hamstring issue in the future. So we see there's loads of stats kicking around about, it seems to increase our likelihood that we're going to have it again. But, we're still, I guess, trying to learn more about how can we bring those rates and numbers down. And it's, football's got some great research around, how our hamstring rehab now has come on over the years, but yet injury rates seem to stay the same. So I think it's a really challenging topic, but I think it's also really important that we normalize injury. And it's sometimes pain. We go back to that pain discussion, but pain is normal, injury is normal. And actually, it's just trying to give people the knowledge, bust a lot of the myths and misconceptions around pain and injury, and helping people on that journey through it.
Yeah, one of those things I think that we need to do in order to help people is to show them these differences potentially in their injured and non-injured side. And a lot of the value in that is that they might not feel that different. They might feel relatively back to normal, but if they've got a 20% deficit in their quads after an ACL injury, we know that that's a risk factor for re-injury. So it's our job to have either skill sets, technologies, things like force dynamometers, force plates, or if you haven't got that kit available, then just getting on a knee extension machine and doing a single leg knee extension capacity test, which might be a close enough way of doing it, or single leg sit to stand capacity test. So there are ways of doing it even without tech, but I think it's really important for us to use objective measurements there. So really use numbers to help show that person that there's still a little way to go, because they might not feel it. They might feel okay, but it's our job. We've got a duty of care in order to help reduce their injury risk. And some of that is using good quality, evidence-based numbers that helps to show that person there's a little way to go.
Yeah. And I certainly think it gets buy-in. I think to any physio listening, getting this data it's really easy. We don't always need high-tech kit. Like I use the Beering-Sorensen test, for example, for back pain.
Yeah,
I love it.
Me too. Yeah.
And just getting a bit of engagement. Patient, I had a guy the other day, hadn't done exercise for 2 years, had kids, just got into that cycle of, just hasn't had time for himself. Why have I got back pain? It seems a real mystery. Actually, he could hold himself up for like less than 20 seconds and he's getting back pain. You think, his child weighs 9-10 kilos and he's holding it 20 minutes at a time whilst he's soothing. And you think, well, it's no wonder your back can't cope with that. And actually trying to get that buy-in of, look, have a bit of trust in me. Let's see if we can get that number up.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens to your pain. Let's have a bit of an experiment. We know that pain is safe.
Yeah.
But let's play around with those stats, see if we can bring them up. And also it's just motivating, right?
Absolutely.
They can do that themselves. They don't need me in the room to be able to redo that test. And you kind of can go, look, we haven't got the data to say, look, if you're at 1 minute or 2 minute or 3 minute, that's the magic number. But look, let's see if we can double that and see what's happening to your back pain.
This is, again, there might be people who listen to it who are pretty switched on and they go, but I thought that improving back strength on that test didn't necessarily guarantee that you they're right. They're absolutely right. The numbers are not always what we would think there might be intuitively, that, better strength in your back extensors means that you'll have less back pain. It doesn't always work that way. There is a nuance. But what I think those numbers do more than anything is they motivate behavior change. If you compare their data to normative data and you say, well, the average person gets this and you're there. What about if we maybe work towards improving that? And they go, great, yeah. That seems obvious to me now. I think my back isn't strong enough. Okay, well, let's try and get it stronger. You're motivating them towards an active recovery, which is evidence-based. You're motivating them towards getting in the gym and doing something that strengthens their body in general. Yeah, maybe some back extensors get stronger too, but it's motivating them towards an active recovery, which is absolutely evidence-based. So I know that the numbers aren't as predictive as they sometimes we want them to be, but I'm also comfortable knowing that it's a behavior change motivator and therefore a very powerful way of getting someone to buy into an active recovery.
Yeah, and I always love the analogy. You're absolutely right. I always think, let's say we've got 10 patients with back pain and 8 out of 10 patients, that strengthening is going to get them stronger. Those 2, okay, they might have some other factors, but for me, I've got someone who's engaged in rehab looking at their numbers. They've got me as a coach or one of my colleagues, which is motivating, reassuring, gives them some comfort. There might be some reasons for their pain, which is like super empowering. And then that might also lead into some trust and some conversations. On the bigger picture, we know that back pain is multifaceted, and there's lots around your mental health and sleep patterns and what's going on at work and all these other discussions. We can start to bring in these other coaching qualities to make that different physio experience. That for me is where I think we take it up a level.
Nice segue, Matt, because I think we are very, very well drifting into the chronic persistent pain conversations now, maybe the kind of more sensitization, because let's say that back injury that someone had 6 months ago has potentially now healed and they no longer have a pattern of pain that seems like it's related to a structure anymore. So their pain is a bit more constant. Maybe it's posture related now. It's no longer every time I bend I get this pain, or maybe there's more fear and guarding in their movement. So these are some things we might pick up on now and think, maybe the structure isn't so much the cause, and potentially their system is now over protecting them with pain and with changes in their movement patterns and tightness and fatigue. So then, we're absolutely in a different realm altogether. So we've gone into depth on acute pain. We're now in chronic persistent pain. This is a tricky conversation even for good clinicians, I find. Even for people who've been around a long time, they're not always comfortable talking about this with people. And I see a lot of chronic pain, persistent pain, and I'm I think the more I deal with it, the more complicated I realize it really is. But it's only complicated if you make a bit of a mess of the connection part. You've really got to have some trust from the beginning. That person's got to trust that you're speaking with their best interests at heart. You're not trying to tell them their pain's all in their head. You're not saying that it isn't real, and that's sometimes how it comes across, by the way. If you're saying that, oh, your back's actually structurally fine, it's actually the way your brain is now functioning. That's the problem here. I go, what, you're telling me it's in my head? It's like, whoa, okay, right, there's nuance here. Ultimately, all pain is perceived in the brain, whether it's acute or chronic. We spoke about the acute pain is signals traveling up from the structure. The brain perceives whether it decides on pain or not, depending on the situation. If that pain signal or that signal has been traveling up then from the structure for long enough, the brain may learn that protection is needed regardless of that signal. So it gets really good at it. So it just predicts that when we are in these situations, or maybe all the time, let's just create pain. Let's just get in a sensitive state to help protect the problem. And it might not even notice that the problem has got better. And we know that there's some factors associated with that. People who do have some mental health problems are more likely to have that, or people that have bad experiences with pain, people that have had lots of trauma associated with the injury, people that have had maybe some nocibic advice, so the opposite of placebo, where they get kind of fear-provoking advice from people, or you shouldn't do that ever again, that's bad for your back. Your back's fragile and you're crumbling here and there, and your scan shows this, you need to be really careful. This stuff's nocibic, so it's more likely to sensitize your system, make it more fear aware, and checks in on the structures more, and it worries more, makes it protective with pain, fatigue, tightness. All these things are potentially not related to the structures, or at least they don't correlate very well with the severity of those structures. So it gets really technical and tricky, and each of these conversations has to be completely different and completely individualized to the person in front of you, and reactive, because you can normally see it. You can see when you say something that doesn't quite align, and you have to then check in and recalibrate, or just try another avenue and try and engage them in what you tell me what you make of all this. It gets really, really tough, and there isn't really any advice I can give on like how to do that. You just got to practice it and research and learn and find ways of saying things that connects, and really listen to the person's story. It's so tough sometimes.
I think you're right. I think you wear many different hats when you get these chronic pain patients. You're similar to yourself, and got a lot of these at the moment, and I think it's just trying to lean on as many skills as you possibly can in terms of different objective measures, so we can work on different areas at different times. I think you really need to understand that person more than perhaps you might normally do in your subjective assessment. So I think perhaps this is where the normal traditional model of, I'm going to say, medical consultations lets us down a bit, in the sense of that's a really time consuming process. Yeah. In someone who's had chronic pain, they've generally seen multiple clinicians. They've potentially had some quite challenging medical stuff going on, whether that's a surgery or an injury that may need exploring. Sometimes not, but sometimes yes. There's going to be some complex beliefs that we want to go through, may have a complex medical history to go through, and actually there's loads of stuff I think that's really important that you give them the time to be listened and heard, because I think if that person doesn't feel like they've been heard, I think you're already going to lose that battle.
Yeah.
Then going down the line, I think you're right, it's focusing on different areas and helping them to understand what their focus is and this treatment, and why it might be a little bit different. So whether that's pain orientated, whether that's goal orientated, or even mood and general well-being orientated. I think sometimes people are quite surprised in physio where I come in and go like, patient this week, I'll go this week because I'd really like her to go for a drink with some friends.
Yeah.
That seems like a weird goal from a physio to give, but actually it really feeds into the model of, but yeah, I've not gone for a drink with friends in 6 months because I was terrified about feeling back pain.
Yeah, because when I sit on a chair for too long, I get pain, and then I get anxious, and I then worry that I can't get home. And these are all valid things, and we now understand that pain needs to be looked at through not just a biological lens, and even not just a psychological lens either, but a social lens. So that's the biopsychosocial model that we should be practicing in. But often it's kind of big bio. We're very biocentric, bit of psycho, and then we kind of ask a couple of questions about social, but don't really know what to do with the answers for. So yeah, having the confidence to lean into the social side of recovery and the impacts that's having on the person, and really seeing it as a really valuable part of their identity and a valuable part of their recovery, is getting that back. When someone comes in and said, I sat with my friends for an hour the other day, and it was unbelievably uh, rewarding just to be able to have that tolerance and have that confidence to do that. And I was a bit sore, but it went okay. Yeah, that's great. It's fantastic.
I think as a clinician, it's okay as well to be a bit afraid. And what I mean by that is, those of us that are more experienced or have dealt with chronic pain might be more comfortable delving into different areas where we feel like we have that expertise, but don't be afraid to lean on colleagues and build that picture. So if you think that perhaps as a physio, your tissue capacity knowledge isn't as good as it should be, that's okay. Well, maybe chat to a PT colleague and get just a bit of input from them. And then maybe you think your understanding of mental health and psychology isn't great, and you think you've got some colleagues that, you go to that person, actually, I think I'd like to see this person, and then bring that information together. Yeah. And actually, you'd be amazed at the skills that you might have once you've got these different bits of data and information, and how for a patient that's super empowering about where they might come to their own conclusions once they've seen a few bits of different data from their whole health, which is really powerful.
Yeah. Having the confidence to say, I actually don't know much about this. I want you to go and see someone else. Maybe go and see this person for a while, and you come back to me. And a few people have said this on the podcast as well, that understanding your own scope, and your scope in some areas might be really big and broad, in other areas might be really small and limited, and you quickly recognize that they need to see someone else, or you even go and upskill yourself because it's relevant and you want to go and learn about it. So there's lots of different things here. I just wanted to pick up again on a theme that keeps coming through on this podcast about different ways of practicing. And you mentioned about listening to someone, really taking the time to understand. And it's this saying that I have said before, is that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's such a repeated theme on here. And I think that's something for people to really pick up on in any form of life, not necessarily just being clinical, but in day-to-day life. I think that's a fact. Really, taking the time to listen to someone, not just thinking what you want to say next and planning on your next move. Really showing empathy and having the ability to be compassionate. I think it's a big skill to have in life, let alone as a clinician.
And I wonder if that is why perhaps some environments the chronic pains do slightly better, because I think acute stuff, we could argue perhaps that it's easier to be not as good at that consultation and get good results.
Give advice.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas I think that chronic pain patient, persistent pain patient, I think it's really important we get that bit right. That consultation's got to be, they've got to feel understood, they've got to feel listened to. And I think that's why maybe they struggle in some environments, because, it is really complex and there's a lot of things to go through, and they're time consuming patients. They're gonna make you think after the session. They're probably the most likely ones to reach out between sessions and, want to have that little more support.
And right, they should. The more engaging the person, the more more engaged they are in their own recovery, the more likely they are to figure it out for themselves, which comes back to that coaching philosophy. So we've got lots of different tools, and it's not all of them that's going to work. We're trying to figure out, what combinations of those things is right for that person in front of us, and that learning process is faster when they're engaged and they understand the learning too. So I really encourage my patients to be physios and think like physios, because I think it helps them learn more and more. And I think there's some amazing resources out there that help people to understand about chronic and persistent pain better than this conversation. But one of the most common things that I end up explaining to people is that the obvious things around that most people have heard of, these little metaphors that you use of, some people that have lost legs and lost arms, they still experience pain in that limb. Phantom limb pain is a very well researched and relatively well understood phenomenon now, and that actually there's got to be something there that helps people understand, there isn't a structure anymore, and they're still experiencing the itchiness, the pain, the weird sensations in the toe that they no longer have. So that's a malfunctioning of a pain system. There's also the concept of brain freeze when you have ice cream. We know full well you haven't got brain damage. We all know that. Within a few seconds, it goes away. The brain the pain system essentially overreacted, got it wrong, it panicked. Went, bloody hell, this is cold. Quick, get away from that. That's too cold. And he goes, oh, it's pleasurable. It's ice cream. It's full of sugar. Actually, go on then. We'll dampen that system down. There's no brain damage after all. It's these really simple little analogies that help people go, the pain system isn't quite as simple as I thought it was. There are some little everyday malfunctions that seem to happen.
I always love the analogy someone once told me of the idea of, to give you an idea of perhaps your mental state on how you might perceive pain, is if you can imagine you're on a beach, you've got a pina colada in hand, you get up from the sunbed and you stub your toe, Imagine what that experience might feel like. But versus the day where the kids are not getting out of bed, you're late for work, you've got a bill that you haven't paid, and then you stub your toe. You can imagine that pain experience is a whole different kettle of fish. So it's a really powerful tool to be aware of.
Yeah. I think it is. It's kind of enjoyably messy and fun for me now, but it's taken a while for me to be able to say that regarding working with people with chronic pain, because it's hard, but when you get it right, it's incredibly rewarding, and that's hopefully gives a little bit of hope for anyone that's out there that's maybe suffering with something that has lasted way longer than they expected it to, and they might just have to find someone that's comfortable having that chronic pain, persistent pain conversation. I think the final thing we should finish on, we're shoehorning this in, I guess, because it didn't quite roll in the way I was hoping it might, but is posture. It's the other thing that people speak about all the time, is what's the correct posture. Go on, Matt, you take this away. What's your answer to that?
So posture, firstly, derived from social class, not from science. So posture was derived from the idea that, we go back to Victorian era, where actually if you were well educated, you were taught that you would sit upright, and that was great etiquette. And if you were slumped, that was perhaps a sign that you weren't well educated, or hadn't been taught well. What we've known over the years is that's then derived into this idea, perhaps, where it's become a bit of a murky water between that and science, probably slightly fed into the fact of, how many times do we see talk of, health assessments at work, ergonomic assessments, desk postures, etc. There were some studies done. We had a look at some studies that basically looked at postures. We actually saw, it wasn't a good quality study, but we saw that actually people in slumped postures had a better spinal health than those with, these straight postures. It wasn't a great study, but it made us think, oh, okay, there's something more going on here.
Yeah.
And what we've started to realize is actually it doesn't matter whether you're in, let's say, a theoretical perfect posture, this etiquette related posture, or slumped posture. We still seem to see that prolonged periods of time in a posture are painful. If you've ever sat in a cinema or you sat bolt upright for a while, it's not very comfortable over an extended period of time. And it's led us now to see that actually it's the changing of positions. We're not designed to sit still. It's that movement that we want. Hence the saying, our best posture is our next posture.
Yeah.
So I think the thing I always give people advice to is it's only relevant if it's relevant. Like if someone's sitting in a certain posture for too long, the first thing I'll focus on is, okay, can we change that more frequently? And then I think secondly, don't get me wrong, if there is a position that isn't very comfortable, okay, well, let's try and see if we can change that. I think the biggest thing is just making sure it's not a one size fits all. For some people that ergonomic chair is comfy, awesome, that works for them. I think for other people, they need to stress less about it. And actually it's just, buddy, you're at the desk for 12 hours and you get up once to go to the toilet and you barely have lunch.
Yeah, I've got another little nugget that's been, I read it a couple of days ago in Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules of Life, I think it is. And he speaks about lobsters. He speaks about lobsters, which is fascinating. He says that when lobsters are battling against each other, they are essentially battling for dominance, because it's the dominant one that gets the best place, that gets the best shelter. It's the dominant one that gets all the mates. They all then want a piece of him, and they want him to make their babies. So they have a bit of a fight. The dominant one wins. He takes the new shelter. The one that's lost the battle then skulks off, and they adopt this hunched posture. So they see this kind of curved up, slumped posture in the one that's lost. Whereas the dominant one walks around, chest up, shoulders back, and he's upright. This kind of, and he's got this dominant posture. So it seems to be that, and this dominant posture then wards off a lot of the weaker lobsters. So they then leave him alone and give him plenty of room. So this posturing thing seems to have an evolutionary background from hundreds of millions of years ago, because lobsters have been around for as long as the dinosaurs. So this thing has been programmed in for hundreds of millions of years. So there is something in that Victorian thing, that there is a bit of a status symbol based on posture. So you can kind of see why this upright posture is taken off. The problem is, we also know that spending too much time in upright posture is exhausting and often not good for our spines, and certainly makes us in pain. So the other part of posture is that mood predicts posture. So these lobsters that have lost the battle, they're pretty grumpy and upset, and then they have less serotonin, they then feel a bit rubbish. So the posture is then part and parcel of it. If you put someone in a bad posture, you make someone grumpy, you make them frown, they feel worse. If you put someone in an upright posture and make them smile in some way or another, they feel better. So it's attached to mood, which is nuts to me. So there is something in posture to some extent, but the nuance is that you absolutely want to be careful not to be spending too much time in that, and that most of the time in a relaxed position, slumping, which I'm doing now actually, is quite a nice comfy position, and it doesn't use so many muscles. So that upright position, using lots of back extensor muscles, is quite tiring in the end. So the one way of thinking about it is don't do it too much. Another way of thinking about it is make sure you're strong enough in order to handle those postures, which is where your resistance strength training might come into play as well.
Yeah.
If you've only got tolerance to sit up for 3 minutes, it might not be the posture itself that's the problem. It might just be that you're not strong enough for it. It's such a great conversation in the end, because there's so many different factors to it.
And there's these really nice. There's a few studies we saw as well. There was one study that showed that obviously people with lower back pain had actually a greater muscle contraction. They seemed unable to relax. Yeah. So again, it feeds into, okay, well, this is the correlation causation. These people that perhaps a bit more obsessed with posture, their muscles are constantly fired up. They're trying to hold the position actually, and seem to be patients that experience more back pain. The other thing is expectation. When we look at people who expect to experience pain in a position, they seemingly seem to, whether that's they think that bad posture means they're going to lead to pain, or good posture is going to prevent them from having pain. Again, it's that belief system of expectation is also really powerful. So I think the big thing for us is to reassure people it's not as important as they think it is. But for some people it works, some people it doesn't. I think the biggest thing for me is a flexible approach to posture, and just seeing what works for you, trying to move a bit more regularly, and just to relax a little bit. And that it's as powerful to be able to support a position as it is to relax into a position.
And if you want to be a lobster, make sure you're upright, dominant.
There's a great Instagram of a friend of mine who I'd scored, Adam, whose page is blown up, and he talks about being a prawn and not being less prawn-like.
So be less prawn, more lobster, or more prawn, less lobster. Depends on what you're struggling with at the time, I guess. Yeah, okay, that's great. Who'd have thought it?
That's the sign-off.
We've ended up on crustaceans. Okay. Well, Matt, great conversation there, and probably more of a two-way thing than the usual podcast, because I probably had a lot to talk about, and quite enjoyed getting deep into some of these topics. But how does someone find a bit more about you, Matt?
So on Instagram, I'm under Physio MMD. Again, love having conversations. So people reach out. We're trying to post more content on the Better page as well. So, engage with that. The more we find out that people want to see, we can chat about, we can go through stuff. But best way to reach out to me is through Instagram.
Yeah, and you're not getting away with it. The new thing I say in these podcasts, I ask everyone, what does Better Never Ends mean to you, Matt? What does that saying mean to you in your life or in your practice? What does it mean?
I think doing everything to the best of your ability. I think putting emotion into things is really important. I think following stuff that you're passionate about and you genuinely enjoy leads to a good outcome for everyone. I think that shines through. So for me, I think better in everything I do is do things I'm passionate about and use that as my avenue and my drive to follow professionally and in my personal life.
Very nice. I was worried I might catch you out with that one, but you've done very well. All right. Thanks so much, Matt.
Thanks, Charlie.
Very enjoyable. Thanks for listening to today's podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Better, provider of health, wellness and performance services based in central London. You can book in for face-to-face services at either of our 2 clinics, one in Soho and one in the city. You can also follow us on Instagram at Better Never Ends, or head over to our website for more information about the clinics or the podcast at www.betterneverends.com. And of course, if you want to send us an email with any feedback, questions or suggestions for future episodes, then email us on podcast@betterneverends.com. And finally, thanks to Brian Long for editing the show. Without him, it's absolutely no doubt in my mind that these would never have seen the light of day. And it will allow this podcast to continue on for as long as I'll keep recording them. So thanks very much, Brian.